Hi, everyone. It's State Representative Natalie Blais. I represent the 1st Franklin District, which includes 18 communities here in Franklin County. Uh, Coming to you sort of live with my dear friends here, just to raise a little bit of awareness about important meetings that are coming up that we hope you will participate in and let your voices be heard to the state. As a result of what we heard from you, the legislature directed the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, DESE, to conduct a study of the local contribution components of the state's Chapter 70 school finance formula. As part of this study, DESE and the Division of Local Services, DLS, will be conducting 5 public hearings, 5 public listening sessions. 4 will be in person and 1 will be virtual. These hearings are intended, or listening sessions are intended to solicit testimony from local officials, members of the public like you, and others who wish to comment on this topic. This is an opportunity for all of you to share your direct experiences when it comes to the local contribution component of the Chapter 70 formula. We really, truly want to be laser focused in this advocacy in terms of what the state is hearing from us and in terms of what you are seeing on the ground. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my dear friend and colleague, Senator Jo Comerford.
Thank you, Representative Blais. Hi, everybody. I'm Jo Comerford. I represent the Hampshire, Franklin, Worcester districts, arrayed along the Connecticut River Valley and then over into northern Worcester County. I just want to pick up where Representative Blais left off, and it talks about the urgent need for your advocacy. You can show up in person, you can send written testimony, but the important thing is that you act. The state is inviting your voice, and we need you to participate. And I just want to note and honor that much conversation has been had around the Chapter 70, the Foundation Budget Review Commission that many of you who are watching are advocating for. And that's certainly important, right? That's what the state sends to municipalities, that plus things like charter school reimbursement and other forms of state spending. But this targeted local contribution, which is the focus of these hearings, is also very important. And guess what? It hasn't been opened up in 18 years. So it is beyond time that we have this conversation. And because it's kind of complicated, we're used to talking about state spending. We're not so used to talking about what the state tells municipalities they can and should pay. We've invited our really great friend, Noah Berger. Now, many of you know Noah from his work leading Mass Budget, a really important statewide budget advocacy and research think tank. Noah moved from there after he explains a hop to MTA, where he is currently leading policy and strategy. And Noah's going to break it down for us, friends. It won't be the entirety of everything you need to know about the targeted local contribution formula, but it'll be enough to give you a doorway into this. And in these posts, these social media posts, I'm imagining there's going to be more information for you. So with that, we're going to turn off our cameras and mics, and Noah's going to hit the road, and then we may have some questions for Noah at the end. But thanks so much for tuning in. Thank you, Noah.
Thank you, Noah.
Thank you. It's great to be here with 2 fantastic legislators, and thank you for everyone watching and who's going to be willing to testify, because there's nothing more important in the policymaking process than people who have direct experience of what's happening in our schools talking about those details. So I'm going to do a pretty quick overview both of how Chapter 70 works as a context for being able to talk about why the local contribution is important and how much it affects state aid as well. But before I do that, I'll just quickly share this screen if this works. And yes, just to very quickly review what the study is looking for. So in the legislation, it had actually a long list of issues, but I'm just highlighting a couple of them. One of those issues is the impact of required local contributions on municipalities' ability to maintain and fund adequate levels of municipal services, including spending on education and non-education services. So this is the big picture of what's happening in your school districts. And while I'm going to talk about some of the details, I think when you're testifying, the core of your testimony should be telling the stories of what's happening in your schools. That because the state is not providing adequate funding and districts are often strapped in terms of local resources, what's not happening? What budget cuts are you seeing? What investments are not being made? What are class sizes and anything else that's sort of very specific examples of how education could be better if the local contribution were fixed, which would be one piece of a broader agenda of also, as the senator said, fixing the special education circuit breaker, fixing charter school reimbursement. But each of these are ways to provide resources that districts desperately need, and making the case for the need, I think, is critically important. The second item is the impact of the fixed 59% local share. So I'll talk more about this, but there's a sort of rule within Chapter 70 that whatever the foundation budget is, which I'll explain, statewide, local districts are required to pay 59% of that, and the state is only required to pay 41% of that. So that's a requirement of large levels of local funding, which obviously in many districts, localities can't afford. And one of the key adjustments that could be made is not having that fixed 59%, which was not always in the Chapter 70 formula. And the final piece is the implications of changes to the statewide target local contribution, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a second. If you want to look at the whole report, there's a link there that you could click on, but since you're watching, you probably can't click on that link, so there's a QR code. If you take a picture of that QR code, it brings you to the page that has all of the information about this local contribution study, which I think is probably helpful to review quickly if you're going to be testifying. Okay, so to sort of put this in context, it's helpful to begin by just looking at how Chapter 70 works. And a lot of people think Chapter 70 is very complicated, and there certainly are parts of it that are complicated, but the basics are pretty straightforward. In about 3 minutes, you're going to know how Chapter 70 works, sort of walk through it. The first step of Chapter 70 is what's called the foundation budget, which is the formula says for each district, there's an amount of money per pupil that it should cost to educate the students. And you'll see here, we have examples for a high income, a low income, and a middle income district. And you see that the low income foundation budget is higher than the high income or the middle income. The reason for that, and this is a good progressive element of the law, is that it recognizes that there are additional resources often needed to educate low-income students and English language learners. So districts with high numbers of those students have a higher foundation budget than those that don't. So that's the first step. The second step is that there is a required local contribution. And that required local contribution differs in different places, primarily based on local property values and local incomes. So if you have higher property values and higher incomes, you have a higher local contribution. That's how you distinguish between different districts, but overall, those all have to add up to 59% of the total foundation budget. So the total local contribution is fixed by the 59% number, and then it's sort of allocated out based on resources in each community. So if you look at it in the high income community here, the local contribution is relatively high. In the low income community, it's much lower because they have lower property values and incomes. And the middle income community, it's actually relatively high. The reason why in the high income community and the middle income community, that local contribution, required local contribution is similar, is that in high income communities and everywhere, there's a rule that no district is ever required to have its required contribution be more than 82.5% of its foundation budget. So in that high income community, in the pure formula, the required local contribution would probably be about twice what it is. But there was a decision made that everybody should get some foundation aid from the state. So there was a decision to cap the required local contribution at 82.5% of the foundation, so that, as you'll see in a second, that means everybody gets at least 17.5% of their foundation budget. So that's something that helps higher income communities. So we'll see it may raise issues of equity with middle income communities. The next step in the process is very simple. Chapter 70 is just the gap between the foundation budget and the required local contribution. So as you can see, it's relatively small in a higher income community, fairly significant in a low income community, and somewhere in between in a middle income community. So if you look at that, it looks like a fairly progressive formula where low income communities actually are receiving more state aid and have higher total spending. There's of course a final step, which is that each district of course can contribute its own resources above the required amount. And when you look at that, the high income communities tend to do a lot because they can. Low income communities tend not to, and middle income communities are somewhere in between. So when you look at the final picture, you do see that picture of the highest income communities spending the most, and then low and middle income communities spending less. Now, what the Student Opportunity Act did was it raised the foundation budget. So that 19,769 that you see in the low income community is significantly higher than it was 5 years ago. And that leads to more state aid, which was the goal of that change. The problem is, because of that 59-41 split, the requirement that locals always pay 59% in their required local contribution of the foundation budget, when the foundation budget goes up, that means that the local contribution also goes up. And I'll just walk you through what that means. So here is, we're just looking here in a low income and middle income community. The foundation budget we see comes from the prior page. Next, we'll look at what the low income district required local contribution is, which is at 6,380. But the next column is what it would have been if it were not for the Student Opportunity Act. That is, when the Student Opportunity Act increased the foundation budget, because 59% of that is paid by the locals, it meant increasing the local contribution also. So that local contribution, instead of being $6,000, is $6,380 in that district. Middle income, same thing, or it's even more, that the local contribution is about $900 higher than it would have otherwise been, because as the foundation budget goes up, that raises the local contribution. It didn't have to be that way. The state could have said, we're going to raise the foundation budget, but hold the local contribution constant, because the goal is to increase state aid. So if they had done that, that's what you're seeing in that third column in each place. The 6,014 in low income, for example, is what that would be. And why does this matter for state aid? Well, as we know, state aid is just a gap between foundation budget and local contribution. So in each case, the state aid is significantly less than it would have been otherwise, because the required local contribution is higher. So this has two effects. One is it means that there's more of a stress on other municipal costs because of the higher required local contribution. And also there's less state aid than there would otherwise be. So when you're testifying, the message is pretty simple, that we had a law that was intended to increase state aid, and because of the interaction with the 59% required local, it didn't increase state aid as much as it might have. It also increased local contributions, and that reduced the amount of new state aid increases. And to fix that, the state could in theory, readjust that and say, no, let's bring the local contributions back down to a more affordable level, perhaps what they would have been without these recent increases due to the law of the last 5 years. And that would automatically generate extra aid. And that sort of brings us right back to the beginning, that the real message is there's lots of stress on our cities and towns and our school districts right now. Our schools need to be doing things that they can't afford to do. In many cases, they're having budget cuts. And part of the reason is the way that this local contribution interacts with the rest of Chapter 70 to provide less state aid than would otherwise be available. So that is just a quick review of how Chapter 70 works, and then sort of how the local contribution rules fit in with that to reduce state aid and what could be done about it. So I will, with that, stop sharing, and happy to talk about questions or anything else.
And hope that we come back, Noah. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Noah. All right, here's a question. So you talked about quickly about the impact of school funding on other municipal services, fire, police, for example. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Because that's one of the things that DESE is listening for. So when you speak with DESE, you can talk to DESE about the impact of your education spending on police, fire, water, sewer, all the other municipal services that your community needs and deserves. So Noah, could you just talk a little bit about that? And then could you also weave in something else this commission is looking at, which is Prop 2.5, and what the heck that is?
Yep. Yeah, thank you for that question. So at the core, Massachusetts, there's a lot that's really good about our school funding system, but it does rely a lot on local contributions as opposed to state aid. And there's a direct trade-off there. That is, the state has resources. We have ways to tax in fairly progressive ways with the income tax, now with the fair share tax as well. Locals rely on the property tax. And we have a system in Massachusetts where property taxes are capped by Prop 2.5. They're only allowed to go up each year at 2.5% plus money from new growth. And often costs grow faster than that. And the required local contributions have, in many cases, been growing faster than that. So it sort of puts communities in a really difficult situation where you have a formula that's telling you how much you need to increase funding for your schools, and you may bump up against Prop 2.5, which requires Proposition 2.5 overrides. And those are tough fights. I mean, they're important fights because often that's necessary to be able to provide, basic important services in schools and in the rest of state government. But it's a real challenge for districts when you have laws that put too much of the cost on locals as opposed to the state. And as we talked about earlier, this is part of a broader system. There are other issues with Chapter 70, the way it caps inflationary increases. So we had the situation now where when inflation was high, the state actually in Chapter 70 capped Chapter 70, and then the other side, Prop 2.5, capped local contributions. So that just held down the resources for schools below what inflation was, which makes it really hard to continue to provide the services that you need. So fixing things like that. Other costs are growing really rapidly, like the special education costs. And there's a special education circuit breaker, which when costs for high income students, if they're over $50,000, the state pays 75% of that, over about 50,000. That's probably in need of reform because those costs are growing really rapidly, and it would make a lot of sense for the state to pay more than 3/4 of that amount, over 50,000, because those are really not costs within the local schools. They're really important services to provide for those students, but it's the kind of services that makes a lot more sense for the state to be primarily responsible for. Then there are other costs like transportation that are going up, where the state reimbursement rates should probably be higher. And the state does do reimbursements for regional school districts, but not at a high enough level. And for non-regionals, doesn't at all. And that's a problem for a lot of districts, and particularly for rural non-regional districts, which there are some of, where there is still long transportation, to drive a long way, but it's not reimbursed. So I think there are a lot of important pieces that need to be fixed, and it's all in the sort of core idea of making sure that the state is providing what it takes to provide the high quality of education in every district. And I think the more folks can just talk specifically about what's happening in your schools and how the inadequate revenue resources for the schools is having a direct effect on the quality of education, I think that's the core message.
Thank you so much. And in fact, the language of the study includes phrases like this: the impact of K-12 school funding on your municipality's ability to maintain and fund adequate levels of municipal service. So that's a direct thing they want to hear from you about. Also, the impact of K-12 school funding on property taxes and the impact of Prop 2.5, as Noah said, on your municipality's ability to adequately fund its schools. These are directly within the scope of what these good folks who are going to travel all around the Commonwealth are listening for. Okay, I know Rep. Blay has a question.
No, that was really helpful, Noah, especially as many of our communities are having to make really difficult decisions when it comes to funding education and deciding what to do with public safety complexes or fire trucks or police, whatever it happens to be, a salt shed. These are really difficult decisions that communities are bumping up against when it comes to Prop 2.5. with everyone wanting to ensure that our students have the very best education. They want to be sure that they're supporting our schools and our teachers and our families. But many of us do represent rural communities and or districts with low and declining enrollment. So I was just wondering are there particular challenges when it comes to the local contribution when we're looking at those rural schools that could also be low and declining enrollment schools?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a really good question. The Chapter 70 formula does not serve well districts with declining enrollments because as we walked through, the formula is based on a per pupil cost. And if the number of pupils, the way that Chapter 70 is, it's that per pupil cost times the number of pupils. So if the number of pupils is declining, the system automatically, in theory, would reduce Chapter 70 aid to those districts. There's traditionally a hold harmless feature, and then there's minimum aid. So each year, districts do get a little bit more than they would have gotten the prior year. In fact, thanks to your leadership and many others, both of you, the legislature last year increased minimum aid, which statutorily is $30 per pupil, all the way up to $150 per pupil. So for those declining enrollment districts, that was an important additional revenue source. But it's still, if you're declining enrollment, the formula sort of assumes your costs are going down, and generally they are not because you still have to have the same number of school buildings and lots of other fixed expenses. So thanks to both of your leadership, there's also now a rural school aid account that provides targeted money for rural schools, recognizing that a lot of these other provisions of our state law don't meet their needs directly. And foundation budget, for example, doesn't account for the additional costs of having fewer kids in a school, which often happens in rural school districts. So I think there are very specific needs that rural schools have that some can be addressed by things like minimum aid, but probably need direct attention with things like rural school aid, transportation aid, and things like that. And even specifically declining enrollment aid is another proposal that was in the rural schools report that it's not yet been implemented.
Yeah, and this is a challenge that many districts across the entire Commonwealth are facing, is declining enrollment. And as you noted, the costs still stay the same. You may have fewer students in your classroom, but you still need that teacher. And this is particularly problematic in rural school districts, but we are seeing this as an issue across many districts across the entire Commonwealth, whether it's urban, suburban, or rural. Thank you, Noah.
I think we probably should end it here. Unless Replay, do you have any more questions? Or
No,
do you
I
have any
think that's
closing
right. I
words?
don't know that people want to listen to us for any more than 30 minutes.
But listen, everybody, I hope we've made it clear, Noah, Natalie, and me, that this is a chance. Again, we want to have a Foundation Budget Review Commission. It's been 10 years, and we should open up all of the spending, right? As Noah said, special education. We should talk about charter school reimbursement. We should talk about rural schools, as Rep. Blais said, and declining enrollment schools. We should do all of that. But this is our chance to talk about this target local contribution, which if we can make some good modifications, could be a relief valve. So remember, you don't have to be an expert to make your voice heard. The commission's looking at all the things we just talked about. So, it's really important just to show up, because when you show up, the state sees, our great colleagues in the state see that this is an issue that motivated you to come and make your voice heard. And that itself will be a service. So tell friends, tell colleagues, please, go to the virtual one, as Rep. Blais said, go to one of the ones that are in person, write a comment and send your emails in. This is a moment for us who care about education funding. That's my call to arms. I don't know, Noah or Natalie, if you want to end with a plea for engagement.
Yeah, I'll say, for us as legislators, the things that really move us are your stories, your personal stories, what you are seeing on the ground every day. so that we are able to make government work better for you. This is an opportunity for you to share your stories to DESE, DLS, so that they can help to make recommendations that will make this work better for you. So again, please make your voices heard. This is an opportunity. Let's not let it slip by. And please do attend one of the 4 in-person or 1 virtual listening session. Noah, you want to send us home?
Sure, just to echo that. We're obviously at a moment when democracy itself feels like it's under attack, and there's a lot we can do to respond. But one thing is right in our own communities to get engaged and participate in the democratic system. And I think that's really what strengthens it when ordinary people show up at hearings, show up at council meetings, show up at all kinds of democratic spaces and build that democracy from the ground up. So thank you for everybody who's doing that every day.
Beautiful. Thanks, everybody. Take good care.